Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615. As a part of our ongoing mission to unleash the potential of local churches to reach the nations, we are blessed to present Season 2 of the Mission Table. It's been said that one of the reasons a lot of churches don't do missions well is because they've not thought about missions well. Well, the Mission Table is a place to think deep about missions and to ask important fundamental questions about God's plan to reach all nations. In today's webinar, we will be addressing the question, does child sponsorship really work? What is the impact on the sponsors? And what is the impact on the children sponsored? We hope that you will not only be blessed by what you hear today, but the thinking will move you to take action. In just a moment, we're going to watch the premiere of Season 2, Episode 2 together. It's about 15 minutes long. But before we do that, I want to cover just a few items. Number one, your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. Number two, as you watch today, when questions or ideas come to mind, and we hope they do, this is about a conversation, mind you, please type them in the question and answer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Once the video concludes today, each table guest will have about 30 seconds to give a summary position statement, and then the table belongs to you, our live web audience. This will be your opportunity to interact live through me and ask questions to the table guests. I want to remind you that this episode of the Mission Table is also being recorded, and it will be available for viewing at www.missiontable.org. Once again, www.missiontable.org. Give me just a second to queue up the video. We'll watch it together, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Does child sponsorship really work? International child sponsorship is for many churches an easy entree into global missions. Today, it has grown into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year charitable enterprise. And with the growing numbers of children being displaced by war and global turmoil, those figures will continue to rise. But does child sponsorship really work? What is the actual impact on the children sponsored and their sponsors? And most importantly, is the gospel being both demonstrated and proclaimed?
This episode of the Mission Table is brought to you in partnership by 1615 Church Missions Coaching and Food for the Hungry. The world is hungry, but the emptiness goes far beyond the table. The need is physical and spiritual. People hunger for opportunity, starve for resources, and have been stripped of value. At Food for the Hungry, we seek to end all forms of human poverty by going into the hard places and closely walking with the world's most vulnerable people. We actively partner with churches, businesses, donors, and sponsors so that in more than 20 countries around the world, Food for the Hungry provides life-changing resources such as clean water, medical aid, food, education, vocational training, spiritual development, and hope. Food for the Hungry. Let's end poverty together.
Watch, reason, and participate. Join us for this episode of the Mission Table. Welcome to Season 2 of the Mission Table. This season, we are again tackling some of the most critical and controversial topics impacting missions today. And the way we do that at this table is by asking questions. We want to ask questions that move conversation, and our hope is that those conversations move God's people to action. I'm pleased to have with me today Randall Davey, Director of Church Engagement at Food for the Hungry, Bob Church, Administrative Pastor at Sagebrush Community Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Doug Lucas, Founder and President at Team Expansion, and Denny Spitters, Vice President of Church Partnerships Pioneers. So gentlemen, the question I have today is a bit controversial. That's the idea behind the table. We want to challenge the way people think, what they think, teach them how to think. Does child sponsorship really work? What is the impact on not only the sponsors, but also the sponsored? Now, before we get into that, let me just frame the question briefly. International child sponsorship has grown into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year charitable enterprise. And if you consider the growing number of orphans from war and displacement, those numbers are probably just going to go up. But does child sponsorship really work? What is the impact on the sponsors and the sponsored? The table's yours.
We're talking about this, and I think it's, from my perspective, in the church world, we do lots of child sponsorships in the areas that we work, and personally, I love them. Now, and here's why. First of all, is I think it's really, really important. It's a great way to get unengaged people in our congregations to be open up to compassion. There's just something about helping a child. It's just a natural thing. I mean, what parent doesn't want to help a child? And second is that what we have found in the countries that we work in, we have a campus in Belize, and what we found is that if we can reach a child, we can reach his parents. And so if we love that child and care for that child and provide for that child, then we get an open audience. And it might take a little time, but that child might come to a service, might come to church, but then eventually, because of that influence, their parents are going to come too. And then we have the opportunity to share Christ with the parents. So that's why we like child sponsorships. We think they work.
I wrote some folks, Matthew, in preparation for this because I really wanted to inquire. And I mean, on the surface, it sounds like who wouldn't be for sponsoring children? I mean, they're always in a vulnerable spot. And in fact, this morning I was up kind of early, communicating back and forth with some of these folks who responded. And one leader of a mission agency that's gotten into child sponsorships a lot, his name is Doug. Also, he said, I always knew that it was going to be of benefit over there. But what I had missed was how much benefit it was over here for the church leaders and the church members. And in communication with another friend named Dave from Savannah, Georgia, he said his church is changing their name from, it was called Savannah Christian Church. They're changing it to Compassion Christian Church because they have such a heart for things like this. And he said the heart muscle is like any other muscle in the body. It needs exercise. And he said, if you start with $50 a month sponsoring a child, then you're more likely to want to sponsor something bigger because you've gotten hooked on helping the world. But some of the answers came back and quite surprised me. The founder of the CHE movement, Community Health Evangelism, wrote back in the middle of today, actually, and he said, I just want you to know I'm not for this. I feel like it creates a dependency. And once that donor pulls the plug on that financial stewardship, the child can sometimes wonder, what did I do wrong? Did I not communicate enough?
Sure.
Was our family being devious with the money? And this guy said there are a whole lot of problems with this. So as a result, I don't advocate for it.
Well, that's a fascinating response. And I think to the simple question, do sponsorships work? I would say yes and no. Because once again, we have to ask what kind of sponsorship. And so if there's a sponsorship plan in mind that addresses that concern, it works. But we then have to define, what does works mean? Is there pragmatic value? Yes. But one of the things I'm pleased, and I can talk about it because I had nothing to do with its design, but the organization with which I'm serving now goes in with the end in mind. And one of the questions I raised early on, is this the most effective way to get money to that person? One of the questions is, how much of my donor dollar gets to the field?
Sure.
And it's a legitimate question. And a person said, well, if you want 100% to go to somebody and have no overhead, just give it to a person on the street corner. If you want a delivery system that says we're trying to address all of the systemic issues and do something to alleviate extreme poverty and have an exit strategy in mind so that that child does not run the risk of that, then as Bob's church is so exemplary, partner with a community so that it's not a one-on-one, because people will fall away.
Well, I'll put my head out on the chopping block a whole lot more and say, yes, it works, but just because it works, there are other questions that we really have to ask. Is it missions? That's one question. Is it strategic? That's another question. Who is responsible for the orphans, widows, etc., in other places other than where I live. Now, full disclosure here, my wife of 44 years and I have supported children. We have no children. We've been a part of that process, but not without asking some really hard questions that sometimes are very difficult to get answers to, much like the person who gave you the response he did. I would say that the pushback on child sponsorship is there's a real lack of strategic thinking about it. Does it work? You know, the vast majority of the top 10 agencies, so to speak, or orgs that receive money, the top 2 or 3 are all child sponsorship missions. And, you know, God bless them. I think there's a great inequality, however, to what's really being done in mission and whether that should even be viewed as mission. So I look at it and say, there are some real issues. There's the issue of dependency that you mentioned before, that he talked about, the issue of family rifts in the family because one child gets chosen, but the rest don't. Political issues where sometimes families have to make choices in order to become involved in those programs and make choices that they wouldn't normally make, but the pressure is there. And I'm not saying this is true of all orgs again. It's not. It varies a lot. You mentioned that before. Cultural confusion, the whole idea that, you know, many times children see all this and it creates a desire level, unfrustrated desires. They're like, wow, look at where my sponsor lives. Look at what they do. Look at the cars they drive. And I think that we don't think about those things because I believe that at the heart of the child sponsorship thing, it's about us. It's about how we feel about ourselves. I feel good about it. Like you said, it's an easy entry point. I can feel good that I'm doing something. I've heard people say, oh, I do some missions. I sponsor 3-4 kids. I'm like, what does that really mean? There's a great movie out. In some ways, the movie itself is not great, but I think it illustrates this. It's called What About Schmidt? And it's Jack Nicholson is starring in it. And it's basically about a guy from the Midwest who is retired. He's lost his wife. He's lost. He doesn't really know how to communicate with his daughter that he's estranged from, but he begins to actually share his deepest kind of yearnings and longings and conflicts with Ndugu, a child sponsor that he begins to pick up that his wife has originally kind of got him into. And he pours himself out to Ndugu in letters. And I say, wow, that's a great picture of many times what people really are doing emotionally. And I think counter to that, I would throw something else on the table. The whole idea of books like The White Man's Burden, which every Christian should read, every Westerner should read, which is significant. And also When Helping Hurts, talks about these very dependency when we're actually, and I've done it firsthand, I've, in my generosity, poured out my pockets, left with the clothes on my back, only to find out in my own short-sightedness, but great generous heart, feeling good about myself, that I did more harm than good and created issues that clouded the ability of the gospel to really be seen clearly. Those are key issues.
Well, and let me address that because I think it's important that, you know, from our perspective, from a church perspective, because I want to speak to churches directly, is that when we look at child sponsorship, we don't look at it just as child sponsorship. We look at child sponsorship and say, what is the end game? So that's when we work with Food for the Hungry and know they have an exit strategy. It's all about sustainability. Our child sponsorship that we're working on in Haiti, that we're getting ready to, it's called Save a Seed. It's sustainable. It's something that it's really just, it's education. That's all it is getting a kid an education to get them an opportunity to have a job in the future. In Belize, it's the same thing. It's a functionality of sustainability. And so that's the one thing that we look at is that we don't want to create that dependability, because that's the worst thing that we can do. And so we have to we always ask those questions. So it's not just kind of a carte blanche child sponsorship. Is who the organization that we're working with, what's the focus of that, and we do child sponsorships ourselves through the local churches that we work with, and like in Juarez, we have after school programs, we have lunch programs in Belize. But those are all through our partners, our local churches, our campuses that we deal with. And so I think that's really, really important is that I agree with you. I think sometimes it can be all about that person where they're checking that box like, well, yeah, I'm engaged because I send $35 a month and I get a letter and we send our picture but yet if there's a real strategy, and I think for leaders, that's the important question is, are we asking as leaders that question? Is it sustainable? Are we creating dependency? When does helping hurt? All those kind of things. I think it gives us a different maybe model or perspective on child sponsorship.
I think I love your answer. Yes and no.
Absolutely.
It can work, but it can also fail miserably.
Absolutely.
Can I interrupt you before you ask this next question?
Please.
I guess I just did, didn't I?
You did.
I did. Okay. Denny, what I thought about when you were talking is to say that was a good illustration of the point that I was making. It sounds to me like you've had a lot of exposure to groups that might have done, or some organizations that might have done harm. Now, I never try to assess what Bob's motives might be, if he feels good or feels badly. What I recognize, one of the reasons that Food for the Hungry does not encourage Doug to sponsor Denny, so that's your kid, is that there's organizations that will do that.
That's right.
The problem is if you're one of 7 or one of 3 and you're sponsored, the other 2 are not, it can cause a lot of internecine strife. A friend of mine by the name of Jim Koppel has an organization called Servant Forge. He's a policy wonk in Washington, D.C., does a lot of work in Kenya, and he's always over there. I said, Jim, how do you get off the airplane and be surrounded by kids and not give something to them? Which is what I did. And he said, well, because I don't want to be beaten up. And that's what will happen. And he said, that's why you have to look beyond that. And so I don't know that the key question is sponsorship or not sponsorship, but it's saying how does that contribute overall to God's agenda? Because it's not about our agenda. I think the scriptures made that clear that we have a responsibility, and hopefully these kind of conversations can say, and here's where we've messed up in the delivery system.
Yeah, I've been part of that. I mean,
So
you
have
said
I.
other people. No, I've done it. I think I just talked with a good friend of mine the other day, and I said, you spent 15 years in Laos. What about the child sponsorship thing in your world? Like, if we could come to the 5-6 villages that you are seeking to plant churches in and come alongside, would you want to see that there? And he said, absolutely no. And I'm like, why not? Because we could bring in education. We could bring in these kids getting fed 1 meal a day solid. And he said, it's a Band-Aid. It is not, it will continue the cycle. Well, why do most of the kids not eat there? Well, because most of them have parents that are either drug addicts on dope and opium, or have chosen to walk a different path where they're abandoning their children, even though they live at home. And I'm like, well, then what is the solution? He said, planting a viable church that has disciples of Christ that will be able to stop the cycle.
So as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be able to watch the whole video because what we want to do now is give our live web audience the opportunity to interact with the table guest. We do hope you will watch the full episode. There's a lot more content, very provocative. It'll make you think. But as we promised, we want our live audience to enter into the conversation. So this is your opportunity to talk to Doug, to talk to Randall, and to talk to Denny. So here's a question. Someone wants to know what an exit strategy looks like. This comes from Larry Hansen. I'm going to direct this to you, Randall. What does an exit strategy look like, and what's the goal? This is from Larry Hansen.
Great question. And you're undoubtedly picking up on our starting point is to go into a community with an exit strategy in mind. And I think as Denny has cited this so many times, groups with good intention create a welfare mentality or dependency. And so our objective is to say, how can we do what we do in a way that we could exit a community in 7 to 10 years having taught and worked with the residents there to create agriculture strategies to perhaps be more efficacious in the use of land. And so that's one of the things. Secondly, what are the kind of medical protocols we can introduce so that we're stopping, at least mitigating the death of 18,000 kids a day due to just some fundamental medical concerns? How do we mitigate disaster? It was a real surprise to me to learn that in areas, for example, that flood every year, there were communities that simply believed that the gods were punishing them, and therefore there was no sense in trying to redirect water flow. So we're working with worldview and often through the church to introduce a God who does not punish by flooding a community, but rather to help mitigate disaster. Fundamental education, encouraging education. And so working through the church with the goal to transform a community to not be dependent on outsiders. Matthew and I have a good friend that I met through Matthew who is actually raising the question as a business owner. How can we transfer skills so that persons in the areas where there's extreme poverty can learn how to support themselves? And I was quick to say with Denny, I was that example, good heart, but did things that probably hurt before I joined Food for the Hungry. And that is to now say, how can we first identify what is important to them, them being anybody with whom we work in any community, come alongside that leadership and share whatever we have as they in turn perhaps transform us in the process. So we then are going to have metrics to measure how many people were vaccinated before we got there, how many people were educated, what were we producing in terms of crops, so that we are on a track to step away and go to another community where there's extreme poverty. If we're there beyond 10 years, we're confessing to failure.
Thank you, Randall. Denny, this question's for you. And Doug, I'd also like you to address this question. Someone comments here, Denny, you mentioned that child sponsorship might be missions. It might not be missions. Can you please explain that?
Yes. I am of the opinion that it's not missions, and I'll tell you why. My main reason for that is that child sponsorship many times perpetuates the myth that what is happening in that context is missions. And often, not always, not every organization, but often, it's actually relief work that's gone beyond or outside of the role of the local church. Sometimes it completely avoids even working with the local church where one exists. And I realize there's some places in the world, quite a few actually, where there's no local church. But identifying believers and having something left. Jesus makes it very clear in the Great Commission that the goal of the Great Commission is not just to go, but to, the primary verb is make disciples of nations. And that's my greater concern. That's the reason that I feel when it comes to identifying it as actual missions efforts, it's found lacking in many cases. Now, that being said as well, I think that it's fair to say that I have met plenty of people who have given to child sponsorship who do not connect with a cross-cultural missions vision, even when there is one in their church. They'll give to 4 or 5 children, but won't hardly separate a dime for a Muslim unreached people group or a Buddhist Hindu group. And I think that shows a lot and tells us a lot about how we view it. Is it work that's valid? Yes. It's compassion work. And I guess the last thing I would say about that is it's important to realize that many times people will give to something like this that's way, way far in the distance when right in their own backyard are foster children in desperate need of a church that will especially bring people along, families along, to connect with them. So I see some disconnects. I don't believe that it really fulfills the role of missions historically, and in terms of the Orthodox kind of idea of what missions really is.
Doug, you represent a mission agency. I'd like your thoughts on this as well.
Yes, and Matt, I found myself in the middle of this struggle. I hear Denny's side of things, and I can certainly identify with that. But in the questions I sent out to some of our workers around the world in about 40 countries, I was kind of shocked at some of the answers I got back. One of our board members, I mentioned him on the broadcast, he said, I started out with the assumption that I didn't want to get involved in this. And then the more our people got involved, the more I saw that it was sort of the toe in the water idea for them. How could we not call this missions when it engaged their heart muscle and starting them caring? So now they're involved in a lot of other ways in the greater missions world, including mission efforts that make disciples and start churches and multiply the church around the world. How could this not be missions if it led them into it? So I found myself really divided. I guess at the end of the day, it reminded me of this book I've got on my library shelf over there. It was called, I think, Ideas That Stick. And it said, if you want to get somebody involved in a movement, you don't want to quote to them all these big statistics. You want to get them identified with one person. And if anything has done a good job at getting people involved with one person, it has been this child sponsorship effort. So I find myself, Matt, all over the table here. I want to hear Denny and I want to, identify with him. But I hear all these board members and workers in our group saying, yeah, but look how it's been effective at getting people involved. So I'm kind of in the middle on this, Matt.
Got it. Let me ask a question. This is not from the audience.
Matt, I would say I'm not in the middle. And as I've shared, Denny and I probably have a different perspective here. And that is simply to say, I don't know that the helpful question is, does sponsorship work? Rather to say, are there organizations that use sponsorship and integrate that with the life of the church for the sake of Christ? The answer is some do and some don't.
Got it. So this is from Kirk Plattner. Regarding the development of a strategic approach and an exit strategy, any thoughts on what to do if the partner church does not share an interest in the development of a long-term vision and seems content with the Band-Aid? So here you have an indigenous local church partner, I'm assuming, and they're really not interested in long range. They're looking for some quick fixes. With all due respect, they're looking for some resources perhaps immediately. And any thoughts on that?
I'd have them call Denny and find some of those bad examples.
You kind of hate, in a way, becoming like a codependent partner, don't you, Matt? Because if you keep on enabling what is, in fact, a little bit of I hate to say it, but like you were alluding to, sort of a misguided reason to get involved, then that's where you get feedback like we got from the guy who essentially coined the Che movement and the current leader of the Che movement. Both of them responded to my questionnaires in preparation for this broadcast, and both of them said child sponsorship is a bad idea. They both said, yes, it's done a lot of good around the world, but a much greater way to help children is to build the capacity of a community by building the local church movement there and empowering that community to reach a broader scale on that community and make a difference in a broader area of transformation than just empowering one child at a time. So both the Che coiner, the guy who invented it, as well as the guy who is at the forefront of the Che movement now, both of them said, I wish this would just kind of go away quietly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there is a sense in which this question reveals an underlying issue, and that is real partnership with people on the field and what it looks like. That takes relationship, that takes trust building. That takes engagement and involvement and investment in one another. And so often, just by going to the money piece, we really ruin the future for what that could be. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to want something for someone else, but they don't want it, or they want it for other motives other than what you had hoped for. And you have to make the hard choices, I think, at that point. It would be helpful for churches to ask the difficult questions and to take some time and make sure that it's not just, if they're going to get involved in a sister-to-sister relationship with another church in India or somewhere else, do your due diligence. It's easy to be fooled, as we have just seen recently with you know, a major mission agency that did a lot of child sponsorship and water projects and so forth, and they're in big trouble right now because they did not use the money for which it was given. So that can easily happen, especially when you're not there on the ground.
Matthew, I might say an answer to that question as well, and I think Denny's counsel is very, very good, and that is to do the due diligence. One of the reasons our organization gets several $1 million from the government to administer is because of our boots on the ground. So if we go and meet a community and have conversation with church leaders, community leaders, and we determine they're looking for a Band-Aid, we don't go there. So we are in active conversation, and to get agreements, we do not go and impose a program. Rather, we're going to find out what's important to them, what they're committed to, and how they are going to participate for the sake of mission integration. But we have groups with whom we simply don't connect. Likewise, we have donors who want to give money for things that we don't support. And so we have to say no to some donors. The reason why it's important for us to find church partners in the States to work with partner churches in the global South, for example, or Africa or Asia, is that we believe transformation comes through the church community.
That's great. I know one of the, I guess, frustrations some people have is that they question whether or not the gospel's being proclaimed. Yes, it's being demonstrated, but is it actually being proclaimed, or does it turn into a social enterprise? And someone asked the question, what evidence is there that sponsorship actually leads to conversion and growth as a disciple of Christ? Some of the exit strategies I've seen do not actually have that as a measure. Child sponsorship money actually goes into community development rather than to help the entire community come to faith. Anyone want to tackle that one?
You know, the biggest study on that that I heard about in these questionnaires I sent out came from a friend that I mentioned. His name is also Doug. He pointed me to this Christianity Today article that occurred in 2013. So I went back and I read that article rather thoroughly, and you guys are probably familiar with it already. It studied 10,000 kids across 6 countries over several years, and at the end, Matt, they were finding a significant impact in educational outcomes. It was undeniable. In fact, the quote was, I forget the way the guy said it, he basically said, you could beat this data senseless. And it was incapable of showing anything other than extremely large and statistically significant impacts on educational outcomes for sponsored children. What that data evidently did not reveal is how much actual discipleship happened as opposed to educational impact. And the article, I think, probably stopped short of drawing any statistical outcome about that, measurable growth about that. So I guess in terms of impact, there's no denying that it had great impact on the education map, but where it went beyond that, I felt like the article stopped short.
Randall, you want to address that?
Well, I think one of the first thing that occurs to me, and I suppose this reflects of the Enlightenment, and that is the presupposition that we can get to some of these answers. You know, for example, if we look at young people, children, young people that have gone through some of the healthiest churches in America and tracked where they are and determined, did the millions we spend on a building or staff or programs, what did that result in? Now, Food for the Hungry is looking at those metrics. What are we doing around spiritual development? I've just found it sometimes difficult to put under a microscope and say, you know, Matthew's converted, but Denny looks a little shaky.
Oh, yeah.
But I will say that it is a very intentional thing. Now, we've had a partner church recently say, we'd like to go to the field and we'd like to go door to door, which was interesting to me because it's a community where they don't have doors, but said, I want to go door to door and present Jesus. Can we do that? And our position has been, it might make more sense for you to equip people who live there to do that, and the people that are going to be there to do the discipleship. And so all I can say is our intent here is no different than it would be at a church here in Phoenix. Are we proclaiming the gospel? I have to confess, I've visited lots of churches lately since I've moved to Phoenix from Seattle, so I'm visiting a lot of churches. And when I go in and experience a Sunday morning, I try to listen through the ears of a person who's not converted and to find out, what am I hearing that would potentially produce a transformation in me? I find it wanting here in the States, and sometimes I think we want something to happen in another community that we're not experiencing ourselves. I don't know if that helps anything, but I'm just saying, I think the intention is to say we believe transformation comes through renewal, life in Christ. I have to trust the Spirit to work in us, and I may not be able to measure in the next 5 years the result of that.
You're right. Go ahead, Denny.
This is a great topic because what it does is it bring this whole idea of discipleship is at the core of what Jesus has called us to do. Mm-hmm. And I would agree with Randall. We don't really do that well in the States because we're looking to maybe in some cases count a number. We're looking for a convert. We're looking for someone to move instantaneously from one place to another. And I know that the Bible has specific examples of people coming to faith like that. But the vast majority of people that come to Christ come to Jesus and are made disciples through a process. And I think that's what Randall's pointing to in a community, that just going in and having people raise their hands, maybe because they'll end up getting something for it or, whatever their motive might be other than for the real reason, is not only unwise, it's unhelpful.
Yeah.
And, I guess, again, what about the church in that place? What are we doing to maximize the church of God and the kingdom of God amongst those people and amongst that group? So inevitably, we have to raise the gospel to the highest level of communication. So I'd just say one thing about that, and it would be simply this. I've had a worker that we have in North Africa who said to me, I asked him, I said, do you have any water projects coming in, anything like that? Oh, yeah. He said, we have a lot of different things like that come in. I said, how does that work out? I said, are they able to use that for the cause of Christ in terms of bringing a witness for Jesus? He said, well, what we have found is not very often are they prepared or willing to share the gospel. So we will come alongside and ask them those questions. And if they say, no, we're not really going to be doing that, we're just drilling the well, we simply say, well, you love Jesus and you love following him, right? And they, yeah, we do. We're just doing this in Jesus' name. So they'll say, well, okay, then we'll present the gospel in a very, very simple way and make people aware that you're doing it in Jesus' name. So I think you see an example of two things that are critical. And, you know, unfortunately, we think disciples are made by the snap of a finger rather than a process, much like Jesus did with his 12 disciples.
Danny, I'm reminded of a book that a colleague of mine by the name of Luis Noda gave to me. It's The Other Spanish Christ by John Mackay, and I think it was written 50 years ago. A phenomenal history from the conquistadores forward of how the church came in and made nominal Christians for the very reasons you said. And then the influence of the Protestant church that sometimes did not do much better. But I think the clarion call is to say transformation will express itself. Now, what I find interesting, and I've heard the same thing, Denny, that just because we have a water at the church, people come to the church for water, therefore it's evangelism. That's no more true than the rage in the 1970s when churches started daycares. And the thought was, it is a ministry. So when I went to a church in the early 1990s and they had a school of a couple hundred students, and I started just walking around the halls, found most of the teachers did not participate in the church, may not have any idea of what our church thought, believed, etc. There was no interface. They simply shared space, as if by osmosis they would come to know about the transforming Christ. So it doesn't matter to me if it's in Africa or in Seattle, Washington, without intentionality, we are going to show up either as humanitarian, or simply crusaders for Christ, or as Christopher Columbus would say, a Christ bearer. But those two to be integrated is going to take ongoing intentionality.
Doug, you were ready to say something, I think.
No, I was just admiring the way these guys are just able to come up with these ideas on the fly like that. And so, no, nothing in particular, Matt.
Well, I wanted to say, Randall, you mentioned that we're not doing a lot of discipleship in the United States, and maybe we're doing it poorly, and that's a great point. I think sometimes the gospel is assumed or it's absent in our churches. And so this is a wake-up call for us. But what I wanted to point to, when you're looking to support a child sponsorship organization, I don't think you can assume they're preaching the gospel. I think you need to vet that partner. You need to do the due diligence and make sure the gospel is not marginal, but they really love Jesus and they believe that the gospel is the only way people are going to be saved. So, one of the things that's occurred to me as we've had this conversation, we had it the first time months ago when we did the recording, and it's continued on, is that not all child sponsorship ministries are created equal. And if anything comes out of this conversation, I hope it's people do some research. They don't assume things, but they investigate and they build relationship, and they make sure that we can say we can confidently give our resources and time because Christ is central in that ministry, right? So this is from Jason. He says, many Westerners believe that the child they sponsor receives direct benefit, while many sponsorship organizations use a community-based approach. This addresses the idea of the marketing myth that your money is going to your child per se. Anyone want to speak to that?
I think he's exactly right. And I think the burden is on the agency to say, here's what we do. Here's why we do. So, for example, we want to adopt an entire community. Some of our colleagues in other sister organizations may go in, for example, and adopt Doug because he's cuter than Denny. And they have the picture of Doug on the refrigerator, and Doug is getting gifts, Doug is getting presents, and poor Denny doesn't. And it really creates a lopsided, unhealthy, in fact, it can cause conflict in Doug's family if his brother and sister are not sponsored. So the best way I can help a child is systemically. I think the burden is on the organization to say, here's how we do that. And so if our belief happens to be that it's as we enable that community to take care of itself is the best way to take care of the child. But we've got
Oxfam, if you go online, just do some basic research about this topic. Oxfam says straight up that the picture on your refrigerator is just a device. It's a device for you to feel good about things, because we're taking all of that money. None of the money goes to the child. It goes only indirectly to community projects that we vet and we decide to do. So yeah, all organs are not created equal, but at the same time, do your due diligence and make sure that if you're going to be giving to one, that you realize, you know, there are your money's not going for that specific reason, and it's probably being pooled within that village or that community for reasons that are very important to that community.
Let me just say, Matt, that in the case of the organization I work with, the picture I have on the refrigerator is the child that I sponsor. I can go to Africa and meet him as a member of a community. See, but he's in a community that's being supported. One of the reasons the money's not going to go directly to a child is there might be a real possibility or probability that either dad is absent, abusing alcohol, drugs, etc. So we want to create safe havens for that child's ultimate long-term well-being. And that's one of the ways we're trying to avoid the abuse of money being handed indiscriminately. We want to have and make sure that our field directors and our partner liaisons on the field are saying, is the money being used for this child's well-being? Our focus is called child-focused community transformation. We want to do the most vulnerable.
Isn't it interesting, though, Matt, that the typical family thinks of it as going to that child, and that's probably the most effective fundraising tool for child sponsorship. And after all, as you've kind of alluded to, isn't it partly because this is such an effective fundraising technique that organizations have been defaulting to this approach? So in spite of Oxfam's best efforts, I think a lot of times the family identifies with that person to the max. And I think when we were out at your place, Matt, we were filming these videos. We talked during a break, and I referred to one of the families that had visited multiple times the child that his family was supporting, and somebody in the said, "Oh, I bet the local church just wished they could have had the 5 round-trip airfares that the family spent in going to visit that child." However, having said that, I can say that in some of these responses I got back in preparation for your broadcast, some of the people who spoke, they were so compassionate about the fact that over the last 10 years or the last 20 years, sponsoring a child for their particular family, even though they were maybe involved in missions already, had really solidified their commitment to being able to help the world that was in need. And you hear countless stories like that. It makes me think that in spite of our best efforts at talking about the community, what has stuck is we're going to help this child. And so I can really see how people are kind of, I guess, confused, or maybe even worse. The leader of the Che movement I mentioned a while ago, he said, quote, "I fear this is actually bait and switch." That was his fear, that it was actually a big bait and switch topic. So it is difficult.
Yes. John here mentions, is it possible to have a mission strategy as a local church in the United States that is both and, that has traditional missions, crossing cultures, reaching the unreached, taking the gospel where it hasn't been, and also have a component inside of the vision that is focused on mercy and justice and compassion? Can you do both?
You know, Matt, I have to say, some of the counseling that you've done, the coaching that you've done with 1615, I know our agency has been invited in by a church after you've coached them, and that's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to bring our group in to help them focus on 3 different unreached people outreaches, while at the same time you had helped them develop a breadth of kind of seeing the big picture, and they were involved in Mercy Ministries as well. So I think the answer to his question is yes. That's the short answer. It's definitely possible.
Yes.
And I would just want to add to that when I was with you in Albuquerque at the occasion of the filming, one of the things that you said that really gripped my mind is to say, we get the idea that we are not to be hurting when we're on the mission field, so to speak, but there's a sense in which organizations that intend to do well can actually hurt the church at home.
Yes.
And that actually has bothered me ever since I was with you. So I think how you, as I watched you work with a church there north of Albuquerque at the close of our meeting, inviting churches to think differently, that is a very helpful and needed voice. So I'm grateful, and I think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's going to happen without some intentionality, which you have certainly brought to the agenda.
Yeah.
I would definitely say it's a both and. However, I would challenge the presupposition that it's pretty balanced. I would say that if you look at the money and you see where the money goes, the pendulum is way, 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 way over to compassion and mercy ministry. And I'm going to say this because I love what Micah says. You know, he's told you, oh man, what is good and what the Lord has required of you to love justice and mercy and walk humbly with your God. That is to be the compassionate heart of Jesus in us. But I think the pendulum has swung so far over that it's now become more and more hard for the gospel to be proclaimed. And it is not in support in general of growing the local church and making disciples in the context of places in the world where there needs to be much more of a balance in terms of a both and from our churches. And I see this regularly as people show me what they're doing, and I think it's definitely a both and. It's in your own backyard. In fact, I would challenge churches, if you are at a place where you are really big into child sponsorship, I would challenge you, is it happening in your own community? Are you seeking to be leaders in foster care for the people that are right in your own backyard? So it is a both and, not either or.
Yeah, someone asks here about the shoebox ministry. I know there's several that do it now, not just Samaritan's Purse, but not exactly on topic, but I do think it's interesting. You know, millions and millions of those shoeboxes go to orphans and impoverished children. Any thoughts on that type of an endeavor?
I would just hesitate to have any of us say anything that takes away from all the good things that our sister organizations are doing. So with a 10-foot pole, I'm not going to say that those shoeboxes, you know, do or don't arrive or anything. I just think we ought to always be supportive of our sister agencies and not say anything negative. I will say that some of our workers in places like Kosovo, they have been approached by such organizations, and they have helped with those distributions, and it's resulted in a lot of great relationships and acquaintances. But I bet you anything, the kind of the focus of the question from the listener that you're quoting, I bet the question is saying, now, do those boxes actually arrive where they're supposed to go? And I'm certainly reluctant to go there if it means that we're seen as, you know, putting down somebody else's efforts, you know.
Sounds good. I will say something about any type of ministry that is blessing kids, and not to focus on OCC or any of the others. I've worked with some churches that have made it a real point to preserve the dignity of the fathers and the families who cannot give to their kids. And so, again, I'm not making a statement like you. I mean, a lot of good has been done through those ministries. But I think this is about doing missions and ministry with intelligence and cultural intelligence. So some groups I know who do a ministry like that, they will network with the families in field and create like a Christmas store concept where they allow the families to come in and the moms and dads present those gifts to their kids. Just food for thought. I just want to stick that out there. You know, it's kind of interesting.
Great idea.
We have a couple more questions here, and we're about to the hour. So let's see. So someone asks here about the mutual transformation piece. I know that's a big one for FH, Randall. The idea here that, and you've spoken to this, Doug, the people that you interacted with, it had incredible impact on their families. Talk about how you have this mutual transformation component, and this transcends child sponsorship. I just think it happens to be something that's discussed a lot in this context. Randy, you want to start with that?
I'd be happy to, and let me say, I want to say this with reverence. I have experienced a sense in which we still tend to go into countries with kind of the great white hope that we're coming in to do something wonderful, and we go home, as Denny has said, we kind of go home with our pictures of what we've done. And so I really challenged that question, saying, okay, is mutual transformation happening? Are we, even those of us who gather here at this place in Phoenix, are we experiencing transformation? I leave Sunday to go to Nicaragua to speak to a group of Latin American leaders. And as I'm preparing to go, I recognize the church in many ways in the global south seems to be faring well, where the church in the global north, not so much. And I'm thinking we need to experience some of the fire, some of the genuine transformation that's happening there. How can I go there as a beggar and saying, I need what you have, instead of coming in with an answer, but to say, for whatever reason I was born in this country, I have some ability to do some things, but I am not even aware of my own poverty in the midst of affluence, and they have affluence in the midst of their poverty. And how do we value that? And again, Matthew, it's some of the things you said to me on our visit that have made me think about that. And so I've actually been raising the question around that Food for the Hungry here to say, how are we fleshing that out? So I think, as Doug said, certainly I know people that have treated a missions deal as a vacation. We're going to go and spend 2 days doing some project, and we're going to vacation in the area. But I know another, Marvin Proctor is an example, business owner in Albuquerque, who said, if I could, I would retire in Bolivia. I care that much about what's happening there. He's a transformed person.
Yes.
And yet I don't think it's happening unless we are open to say we're going in there as debtors and as beggars to grace. And how may God speak to us through those communities we are serving, because God has called us to be sensitive to the least of these.
Yeah. I think it was Brennan Manning who said, when doing is divorced from being, pious thoughts become a substitute for washing dirty feet.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think whether it's child sponsorship or any type of sponsorship ministry, if the agency, if you will, says you can give us some money and that's the extent of what you can do, it makes me concerned, because it becomes easy to check a box and you no longer wash dirty feet. Now, I realize in many contexts, it's not possible for us to get boots on ground and serve like in unreached places. But I think agencies have a responsibility regarding this mutual transformation piece. What are we doing to interact and build relationship with our financial partners that helps them with their spiritual journey and become closer to Christ? And I think a big part of that is getting them engaged. It's not just money that you put in account. We have limited time. I'm going to allow each of you to give a short summary statement about your position on the discussion topic today.
Well, I'll take advantage of the time while Doug and Denny give more thought. The thing I'm aware of, or the thing that gets me out of bed every day, is the awareness that we have 18,000 children under age 5 dying every day due to lack of medicine, water, adequate food. And we have a lot of persons that have survived the 5 years that are cognitively impaired, persons who will never hear the gospel. And so I'm not able to bifurcate food and gospel And I simply believe that there are a number of organizations that are doing what they're doing in an attempt to fulfill God's vision that none should perish, all should have everlasting life, and that in a holistic way is our call to simply eliminate poverty in extreme places.
Denny, are you next?
Go for it, Doug.
I was just going to say that the summary statement for me, Matt, is that statement that I might have mentioned to you when we were out there. Guy from North Carolina called me up at about 5 a.m. There in Albuquerque when we were doing this filming with you. And he called me up on the morning of the filming to say this: Doug, you asked about child sponsorship. Does it matter? What difference has it made? And he said, here's what I want to tell you. It's my family's chance to be faithful to reaching out to someone who's in need. And he said, by doing that, I feel like I've made a statement to the people around me, to my own family, my kids, and also to the church where I'm involved. He said, does it matter? And this guy is like 20-year Army veteran, helicopter captain, extremely, he's the kind of guy you see in some kind of Afghanistan documentary. And he said, does it matter? You bet it does. We have to make this difference, and we have to make it now. Now, here's the thing. This guy is spending his life recruiting missionaries to go over and work among unreached people groups. But to him, this is a personal mandate. He has to be involved. And after I saw that, I thought, you know what? Maybe you can't separate it. The heart and the head and the hands and the feet, they all go together.
Good.
I think that's well said. I'm thinking of what Jesus said when he said, if you've done it under the least of these, and then he qualified it very clearly. He said, well, when did we do it unto you, Lord? And it was like, well, when I was in prison, you came and visited me. When I was sick, when I was hungry, you fed me, etc. I think that Jesus, however, is talking primarily in context. And what gets me up in the morning is the fact that there are many people in the world who do need the life-giving taste and have a need for the gospel to be given to them. And it's not an either or, but we must go with what eternal value is, which is the glory of Christ in that moment. I don't know of any of our workers who are doing things in unreached places who are not bringing value to the community, and by and large who are seeking to bring the gospel hand in hand with whatever their best contribution can be within that community. I would challenge all of us to think clearly, strategically about the fact that there are 3 billion people, probably at least, who have not had that opportunity, and that we would balance strategically how we will bring the gospel to those places and how we will let Jesus build his church through Jesus followers who go to bear his witness in those places. Let's be wise about how we spend our money, not just passionate, and let's trust God to do what he wants to do throughout the world.
Yeah, Denny, you mentioned the unreached, and it occurs to me that those who have such a heart for impoverished kids, and they're invested in child sponsorship, and thank God for that, but there are places where there is no local indigenous Christ-centered church, so there's no impulse for mercy or justice or compassion. So I would say, yes, let's reach out to the most vulnerable, the kids in these places. And I know FH, for example, they only work with local churches. That's one of their convictions. But let that not be a substitute for planting the church where it doesn't exist. Therefore, there is no cold glass of water being given to the little kid.
Amen.
In Jesus' name. It is
Amen.
It is both and. In conclusion today, I want to let the audience know that these are now available on iTunes podcasts. You can subscribe to that, and they will go to your podcast app. Also, the next episode of the Mission Table airs May 10th, and we continue the tough questions. Are compassion ministries truly compassionate? So it's a great segue out of this conversation. And we're going to be talking about the realities of temporal and eternal suffering, both of them. Also, this has been recorded. As I mentioned, you can watch the entire 30-minute produced episode, but this very conversation was also recorded and will be available in the next few weeks at missiontable.org. Thank you again, Randall, Denny, Doug. Your contribution to this conversation has been really rich. I am blessed by the partnership we share and the ability to swing swords together and to help the body of Christ think about these very important topics. So again, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today, and thank you to our live web audience. We hope today was a blessing. I am Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615.